I am okay. Now it's on. Yeah. Good afternoon. It's very cold outside and very hot inside. So this is like extreme weather events. Welcome to the side event organized by the South Center, which is an intergovernmental organization of 52 developing countries based in Geneva, and the Third World Network, which is a non-governmental organization headquartered in Malaysia. My name is Meena Rahman from the Third World Network, and I will moderate the session today. Um, it, our focus is actually on expectations for COP22. And we are very happy to have with us a very distinguished panel. We have Mr. Ravi Prasad, who actually literally stepped out of the plane and is joining us. So he has honored us with his presence, and he's the representative of the government of India to the United Nations climate talks. And he will be followed by Mr. Sher Ji, who is actually the Director General for the National Reform and Development Commission. Many of you may be familiar with Director General Su Wei from China, who is who's not a new face to the negotiations. Mr. Sher Ji has taken his place, and we are very privileged to have him be with us to speak at this meeting. And then we will have Mr. Yobo Sokona, who is actually a very well-renowned person from Mali, who is also the vice chair of the IPCC, and he is also now leading the Africa Renewable Energy Initiative. And he would share with us a lot of insights about what's happening on the African Renewable Energy Initiative. And finally, we have Ms. Mariama Williams from the South Center, who is really a climate finance expert, who will be focusing on the climate finance issues, particularly on the roadmap to the $100 billion, whether the money is there or not there, or what's happened. And she will also be quite interesting to hear. So we hope you can stay with us. And without further ado, what I'd like to do is to invite Mr. Ravi Prasad to speak, and followed by Mr. Sher. After that, we will open for question and answers, because both of them have to go back to the negotiations, as you can imagine. And then the rest of us will continue to be here and hope that you can stay till the end. So without further ado, Mr. Ravi, please, over to you.
Good afternoon, friends, and thank you to Meena for inviting us here, the South Center and the TWN. My co-panelist, Mr. Sher Ji from China, Yuba from Mali, and Mariama from South Center. This event of South Center and TWN I have not missed since I have become the chief negotiator for India. So this time also I made sure that I am here in time for this. We have very high expectations from Morocco. While we have achieved a lot in Paris, we have an agreement which has the backing of 196 countries. Some is still in the process of ratifying it or getting their internal processes related to it completed. But we all know that most of the countries have signed the agreement, indicating their intent to be bound by it. And therefore, the COP here in Marrakesh is very important, as it is going to set the ball rolling as far as the process of implementation, framing of rules, guidelines, and modalities are concerned. So from our point of view, it is very important. And I know that the COP presidency has put in a lot of efforts to make sure that we come up to the expectations that the world has on this conference and climate change in general. One of the most pertinent issues that has been there in the minds of most of the people who have been following the climate change negotiations is this issue of entry into force and how it is going to impact countries which are still in the process of completing their domestic ratification, approval, or accession, whatever you call it. And there is a lot of momentum on it, and I understand that a general understanding is also emerging that even if countries have not been able to complete their domestic processes, they will be allowed some time to do it, to make sure that when the CMA convenes, it is able to take all the parties together in the manner of inclusive decision making that has been the hallmark of Paris and our earlier decisions also, so that all parties who are working towards putting this framework in place, they are not deprived from participating in the decision making process. So some time to be allowed for countries which are still in the process of ratifying it. As you all know, a large number of countries, including India, has already ratified it, but we will wait for our other colleagues to join in as soon as possible. And hopefully there would be some timeline to this process so that no one is left behind. The other issue that we think is quite important is this whole area of pre-2020 actions. While the Paris Agreement is related to post-2020 actions, we cannot uh, forget or put aside the pre-2020 actions. So the whole regime of the pre-2020 actions, including the ratification of Kyoto Protocol, including the revisit of the targets that developed country parties have taken under Kyoto Protocol, uh, the provision of means of implementation support for developing countries, finance for adaptation, mitigation, technology development and transfer, and capacity building to enable countries who have taken pledges under Cancun Agreement to make them fructify those intentions. The kind of support that is required is still not there, and we hope that during the facilitative dialogue, there are two types of facilitative dialogue that we are expecting during this COP. There is a facilitative dialogue discussion which will focus on 2018, but there is another facilitative dialogue which is focused on the immediate actions to be taken. And we hope that in this later facilitative dialogue, we should be able to chart some kind of a map regarding the pre-2020 actions and what kind of timelines we are going to follow there, and what countries are going to bring forth to the table as far as this important aspect is concerned. So that is one of the most important issues for this COP, and we hope that we are not found wanting as far as the pre-2020 actions are concerned. We are able to show acceleration in those pre-2020 actions also, and have a solid ground for how things will shape up in the post-2020 period under the Paris Agreement. So that is an important consideration from our point of view. I'm sure our colleague will talk about finance, the roadmap that has been presented for 100 billion US dollars, the same kind of OECD report we had seen in the last COP also, and there were numerous issues related to the presentation that we saw there. We find that the current presentation is also having similar issues. We are not clear about the new and additional climate finance that is coming on the table. We are not clear about how bilateral flows are getting counted. We are not clear about how the multilateral development assistance that has been part of the development paradigm that we have, the official development assistance that is provided to developing countries. The consensus was 0.7% of the GDP of developed countries would be contributed for this ODA. So how it goes beyond that is still not clear, and that is some of the questions that many developing countries will be raising during these discussions here. This was just presented during the pre-COP, which was held in Marrakesh 18th, 19th October. So countries didn't have a time to react at that point of time. But now, during this 12 days, we should be able to bring out some of the problems that we see in the presentation, which has come up in the roadmap to 100 billion US dollar. And I'm sure our colleague Manema will throw more light on that. The third aspect that we feel is very important is the technology development and transfer. The issue is that we are talking about long-term, low-emission developments. We are talking about transformative development, but are developing countries enabled to do that? Do we have uh, flow of technologies affordable, accessible to developing countries to make sure that they are able to make this transition? And there we find a lot of lacuna, there we find a lot of gap. Because as you know, there is a cycle which technology follows, there is a diffusion process. It's a time consuming process. It doesn't come up at the same time when the technology has got conceived or has got commercially viable. For the developing countries, there is a challenge to adopt those technologies. There might be cost differentials, there might be patent issues, there might be IPR issues, and these are some of the black boxes that we want to open up in the discussions. We have raised these issues earlier also, but we have not got adequate and clear answers for them. So that is also an area, because we are looking at, countries are talking about putting across 50-year long low emission development pathways or action plans. But without a clarity on technology flows and transfers, it will be very difficult for developing countries to do that. And we hope that during these discussions here, we are able to work on ensuring that actual transfer of technology and their grounding is expedited, is facilitated, and the developing countries find themselves empowered and enabled to undertake what is expected of them and what many of them are wanting to do. In fact, even in our country, our Prime Minister recently in a BBC interview said that India is taking very ambitious actions on renewables. We have set a very, very ambitious target of 175 gigawatts, but we can do more if finance and technology is provided to us. So the kind of ambition that developing countries have is really unparalleled, and it needs to get the support, required support in terms of technology and finance to really reach the heights that they want to do. Apart from this, capacity building, I'm sure we are going to see the formalization of the Paris Committee for Capacity Building during this COP. It is an important area of work. And we hope that this will really help developing countries in bridging the gap in terms of their ability to handle issues related to climate change. And we have been talking about an enhanced transparency framework building upon the existing transparency frameworks. So there is a system of reporting for mitigation actions, for other actions, along with reporting for support. And we hope that there would be more clarity on these issues and how we want to take them forward. And we would expect that any call for action of transparency of action is matched with a similar kind of transparency of support, because that is going to help developing countries plan their actions better. If you have had a detailed look on the INDCs or NDCs that developing countries have projected, there is a very clear element of need for support, need for finance indicated by many and most of the developing countries. So there has to be some kind of matching done there, and the support which is provided by developed countries, that uh, roadmap, that kind of a future plan of action on support must also be clear to enable developing countries to plan things better and to ensure that their climate goals are met. I won't take long. There are a whole lot of global action agenda which the COP presidency is highlighting. One of them being the uh, efficiency, renewables and energy efficiency initiatives in Africa, adaptation initiatives. There is a NDC partnerships which is getting set up. There are some discussions on having sustainable oasis, blue belt protection. All kind of initiatives are coming together here, and we support all these initiatives because they help countries see what others are doing and how they can benefit from the experience of others. We hope that many of these are initiatives which get recognized as well as transferred to other countries, where other countries are able to adopt those models in their own world to work on climate change actions. And lastly, we see Marrakesh as a part of the continuum. We have had series of decisions before Marrakesh, and we are going to have series of decisions after Marrakesh. So it is part of that continuum. We hope that it plays the role of kickstarting the process which we agreed to in Paris, the Paris Agreement, and all those follow-up actions which emanate from them. We are able to take it forward here, and I look forward to very fruitful and useful interactions here, and hope we have a successful COP during these 12 days. Thank you.
Thank you to Mr. Ravi for a very comprehensive presentation covering both pre-2020 and post-2020 expectations. So it gives me great honor to invite Mr. Sheji to speak on the same topic of what you expect out of COP22 from the Chinese perspective.
Good afternoon, everyone. So first, would like to thank Mina and invite me attend this side event. So I think for this Marrakesh meetings, so I think the many people expect this meeting will be the successful and have the good result from this conference. So I saw that many of you have seen a slogan on the flag by the tree. The slogan is, it said, the act. So I appreciate this word. So we think we now need to take the action stronger than before. Just for the case, maybe I'm not sure if you have the chance to take the shuttle bus. One type of the shuttle bus is electronic. The bus is made by the China. It means this bus is not use the gas engine, but it's use the electricity battery. So this is, I think, just for the one example how to take action and to reduce the greenhouse emissions. You know, for the China, we have just published the 5 years plan to reduce. The plan is a set of the target to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We expected to reduce the greenhouse gas emission about 18% of the carbon emission intensity. So this is the target. And also in this 5 years plan, we have the drafted the roadmap and also insensitive policy. And we hope that we can find some cooperations with the developing countries. During this couple of days, I have talked one topic with Mina, so how we can cooperation to enhance of the capacity, the building. So we have set up the capacity building training program. We expect in the 3 years, we can offer 1,000 participants coming to China and get the training program. So we hope that this this is the program can offer more and more the chance for the developing countries and the staff and expert and to learn some of the technology and to share experience with China. So this is what we hope that we can enhance the South-South cooperation with the developing countries. I think it's just a very simple the thing I'd like to offer. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Siaji, for stressing the importance of South-South cooperation and how we will try to help developing countries a lot more in learning and sharing and building our own capacities as we engage in the multilateral negotiations and stress the importance of North-South cooperation as well. Now, I'll open the session for, like, say, about 10 minutes or so to invite questions. I would like you to both these two members of the panel, stay on for the others, because both Yoba and Mariama will have a lot to say. Identify yourself and pose your question quite briefly. Does somebody have a mic which is roving? Mic from the technicians, please. So please raise your hands if you have a question. Okay, I'll take one question from the young Indian youth there, and one from the gentleman at the back. And say to whom you target the questions to.
I think this is Siddharth from Cannes. There's no target to the question. It's just, I just wanted to sort of get some clarity on the facilitative dialogue for 2016, and particularly on what the expectation in relation to the outcome would be. Like, in what form would you see an ideal outcome, whether it would be in a chair summary or would it be a set of COP decisions? So that clarity would be very helpful, because all the issues that you raised, I think, need a further roadmap. And the second part is in terms of the champions that you talked about, the two champions, how do you see them playing a role in the facilitative dialogue and the follow-up from the facilitative dialogue? Because they're supposed to present a global framework for climate action, and how that sort of links up with the conclusions of the facilitative dialogue would be, in your mind, would be very interesting to hear. Thanks.
Thank you, Sid. The gentleman at the back right there. Introduce yourself.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Curtis Dobler. I'm a professor of law at the University of McKinney in Sierra Leone. I just wanted to ask either of the speakers, perhaps. The United States has joined this agreement as an executive agreement, which under American law is not legally binding. Is there any thought being given during this conference to creating an instrument or a mechanism that would be able to hold states to this agreement? Right now, the implementation provisions are very weak. I know that Bolivia in the past COP suggested a climate tribunal or a climate justice tribunal. Is that off the table now, or is there any thought being given to an implementation mechanism? Thank you very much.
I'll allow a third question. Anyone? Yes, gentleman at the back.
Thank you. My name is Fazalisa from Forum CC Tanzania. My question goes to the representative from India. You mentioned the importance of working on pre-2020 issues. So I was just wondering on how exactly have you planned to work on the Doha Amendment to see the the Kyoto Protocol is ongoing, even if now the whole concentration are on Paris Agreement. So you have, maybe parties have certain mechanism that you can put the Kyoto Protocol on roll. Thank you.
Ravi, I think a lot of the questions are for you.
Very important questions. Let me go one by one. First, on the facilitative dialogue. The general focus has been on the facilitative dialogue in 2018. So if you look at the agenda for APA, which will later on also be part of something that CMA would be doing, the focus is on facilitative dialogue in 2018. Now, the contours of that facilitative dialogue would be decided, what all it will cover and what its implication will be. Those things will be the subject matter of negotiations in the coming few days. But this 2016 dialogue that I was mentioning is part of the decision which focuses on pre-2020 action. And the question here is that if countries are today talking about a timeline for ratification of Paris Agreement, if countries are saying that those countries which do not ratify the Paris Agreement by 2017 or 2018, they would not be part of decision making under Paris Agreement. Because if you look at the rules, it says that all those parties which have ratified the agreement or approved it or acceded to it, others can be part of it as an observer, will sit in the meetings. But if something comes to a decision making stage, these parties which have not ratified it will not be able to exercise their powers there. So that kind of an arrangement is there, and now we are talking of a deadline for doing it. So the question is, why are we not having a similar kind of deadline for Kyoto Protocol? We have been looking at its ratification for so long. What prevents the global community to decide that the Kyoto Protocol has to be ratified by, say, the mid of 2017, by a certain date? Because we have already given 5-6 years for people to go through the legal requirements and niceties involved in that. So that would be one of the issues. The issues of revisiting the targets. So the expectations are very clear that the kind of ambition that was displayed by developed country parties in their pledges under the Kyoto Protocol is not enough to bridge the emission gap. There is an emission gap which is existing in the pre-2020 period. So if we have to bridge that gap, what are the kind of actions that need to be taken? Who is to be responsible for that? What kind of timeline do we need for that? So these are the issues which need to be brought out and discussed, and some kind of a roadmap agreed to under the facilitative dialogue. Similarly, for this $100 billion goal that we have till 2020. People are talking different things. Recipients have a different picture of what they are getting. Donors have a different picture of what they are giving. So how do we bring about a synergy and a common understanding of what actually is climate finance flow and what we should be counting as climate finance flow? So those are the issues which we want to bring to the table. We want to bring to the table the issue of technology transfers and development, because that is also crucial in this whole debate. In terms of the work of the champions, we will be having champions every year. So initial champions were from France and Morocco. Now the next COP, wherever it is held, we'll have one champion from there. So it is going to be part of, again, a continuum. There will be people who will be joining in, but then they have set forth some kind of a map where they want to bring in all the actions which are being taken by civil society, by NGOs, etc., in some ways at a common platform to motivate, to help, to guide better actions in all the countries. So it is a welcome step, and we'll see the complete unfolding of the action agenda that they are going to put forth here. As far as the second question regarding USA joining in was concerned, legally there is no bar in countries joining through an executive order. It is the domestic pattern or domestic regulation of the country that decides that. But once a country has joined the Paris Agreement, it cannot come out of it for the next 3 years. So irrespective of the outcome of the US elections, for the next 3 years, the US is bound to be part of the Paris Agreement. What happens after that is something which is very difficult to predict as of now. And being optimists, we are hoping for the best, and we are hoping that things will continue in the same cooperative manner as we have now. Doha Amendment we have already covered, and something on the climate tribunal, it is something to be decided by the entire group of countries, all the parties. And I am not very clear about how it is going to play out in the real world. So I won't be able to comment a lot on that, but I am aware of this proposal which has been made by Bolivia. And we hope that we'll have some opportunity to talk about these issues also when we talk of implementation and compliance regime and issues for the Paris Agreement. Thank you.
Thank you very much to both Mr. Ravi and Mr. Shea for taking your time to be with us. I think as civil society, we just had a press conference a while ago organized by Friends of the Earth, and some of us were there. We are all very concerned that the focus is so much on post-2020 action on the Paris Agreement and very little focus on pre-2020. And so we're very happy with the questions that were raised about the Doha Amendment. It's nice to count civil society and non-state actors as initiatives, but government cannot abdicate their responsibility and the existing legal obligations they have. So many of us have been calling for very strong action on implementing the Doha Amendment. And for some of us who have been following the process, we recall very clearly in starting from Durban that the whole the process towards a new agreement under the convention, which is now the Paris Agreement, was predicated on the developed countries fulfilling their existing obligations under the convention and the protocol. Now that seems to have been forgotten. And I think if Marrakesh COP is supposed to be an implementation COP, then it has to ensure that we do have very strong implementation of existing commitments, and not just all these initiatives and platforms and talk shops and workshops, and which at the end of the day don't, although they may count, but they don't actually show the seriousness of our states. So we look forward to working with you, all of you, in pushing that. And we will come to the African Renewable Energy Initiative in shortly, but allow me to thank the two panel members from China and India for being with us, and we look forward to a very good outcome in Marrakesh. Thank you very much. Now, without further ado, allow me to now present Dr. Yoba Sokona. Some of you may have heard about the African Renewable Energy Initiative. In fact, the COP21 president this morning, Madame Ségolène Royal, paid special tribute to it. And she also claimed that she had submitted some proposals or projects under the initiative to the UN Secretary General. But I think it's very important to hear from Africa itself about the African Renewable Energy Initiative. And nobody is better than Dr. Yoba Sokona from Mali to explain about the initiative and what's been happening, what's the progress, and how do you see it go forward as a concrete outcome of Marrakesh, and in terms of the commitments of developed countries to actually ensuring that Africa is on the path to renewable energy. Dr. Yoba, over to you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mina. I think I will not be too long. It's better to have a conversation on some of the, as Marrakesh has been said that is on action. And I will try to focus on something that is on action, not thorough discussion. During the discussions of the Working Stream 2 of Durban, the African group of negotiators came with the idea of scaling up of renewable in Africa, in different parts of the world. And this idea has been developed purely by the Africans. There's no other outside. From the idea of renewable energy, what it can be done with it in the continent. And then a concept has been developed by African purely. And then from that, the initiative has been developed and presented in Paris. And then that was the first time African came to any COP with a concrete proposal put on the table, conceived by them for them. And it's about jump-starting renewable energy power systems with an access for all. Why jump-starting? Because the energy system in a continent is not locking, because the system has to be developed in the continent. There is very limited infrastructure, and then that need to be protected, because investment, we have to wait till the end of the cycle of investment to replace it. We can jumpstart. This is not the case of industrial economy. This is not the case of emerging economy. We can jumpstart. That is why. And what is about this initiative, as I indicated, is African-led, conceived, developed by Africa, and focused on development. It is not starting with the climate, it's starting with the development issue and how to make development more sustainable. That is important. And it explicitly addressed the issue of production, the issue of development, because the critical target is the productive sector of the continent. If you look at the proliferation of many energy initiatives in Africa, none of them is addressing one of the key fundamental problems of the continent, the small-scale farming system. You will find rural electrification, it ends up to be rural lighting. You will find many other programs, but there is no comprehensive program that addresses the issue of productive sector, particularly the small-scale farming, and then that employ more than 60% of the people in the continent, less than 2 hectares. And renewable are the only technology that allowed to do so. And also, there is a proliferation of small-scale, micro, mid-sized enterprises. And then we all know that one of the major problems they are facing is energy, particularly in peri-urban area. I do not know also anyone in rural area. It doesn't matter if they can increase the production, the productivity of their sector. The transformation is made in the urban area. It's exactly the kind of relationship between developing country and industrial country. And then you produce raw material, and then it's shifted to have added value elsewhere. And this is exactly what happened with the rural area and the urban area. And it's development focused, but it's climate compatible. There is a way of bringing the two together. And it's open to a widened participation and collaboration. And much more important, it's in conception, a wider, a multi-stakeholder effort is needed in order to the initiative to be transformative, because it's about transformation. And the goal of the initiative is to bring together energy access, one hand, and climate. Sometimes they're antagonistic. And then if you want to do the energy access, the most thing you do, you go for fossil. You go for coal, you go for diesel, you go for everything. And it's in contradiction with climate. But this initiative, ambition to bring those two together, and it's possible, they can be compatible. And what this initiative expected to achieve, it's modest. It wants to achieve 300 giga of new and additional productive capacity in Africa by 2030, with an initial 10 giga by 2020. This is tomorrow. This is nothing. Anyone who knows Africa and then anyone who lives there, this is modest. And at the same time, it's highly ambitious. because the entire capacity, productive capacity of the continent in terms of electricity, I'm not saying energy, is 150 gigawatt. If you want to double that by 2030, this is highly ambitious. It's highly ambitious if we want to achieve 10 giga by 2020, having in mind the continent just put on the grid 1 giga per year. This is highly ambitious. But at the same time, the ambition is explicitly and to increase the absolute number of people connected to the grid. This is important. And then to increase the absolute share of renewable in the total energy mix, not only on hydro. And then to increase the share of local African film producing the equipment and supply. It is not only to import equipment, it's to produce local, to manufacture locally, the entirety on part of the equipment. This is the ambition of the initiative. And then there is a number of key precepts. And then in order to work clearly, the continent has told you ownership and then the country ownership. This is not any other institution-driven approach. That's important. And then it's also to multi-stakeholder participation and social and environmental safeguard is crucial, fundamental. Transformative and programmatic approach is not about projects, it's about transformation. It's about programmatic. We cannot build, we cannot develop with projects. Smart, modern, distributed renewable systems of the future. Renewable allowed you to produce less than 3 watts to more than 100 megawatts. And enhance also private sector, public sector engagement at various levels. In order for that to happen, if you want transformation, there is a number of drivers. And then for the transformation, and then we identify 5 main drivers and 4 cross-cutting drivers, all equally important. Unless you address all them together, you will never have transformation happening. And when you go on the project classical business as usual model. The first one, we need coordination, we need cooperation, we need to have a clear understanding what is happening. Mapping is crucial for that. Second, the policy, the regulation, the organizational incentive framework is important, is equally important. And then we start also as a crucial core area, capacity mobilization. Most of the discussion is about capacity building. While we have a lot of capacity, let us mobilize capacity that exists. If it's lack, we need to look at the capacity building. We cannot jumpstart the capacity building. And then when capacity is lacking, it will take time to build. We have strategic partnership. This is the third area. The fourth, we have to make the distinction between finance and funding. They are different. You need financing in order to have fund. You need funding in order to have the finance. And then the fifth area is project support and development. Along with that, we have identified also 4 cross-cutting areas equally important. You need to address those also in order to have the transformation. The first is social and environmental safeguard, as I indicated. Second, multi-stakeholder engagement. Third is wider monitoring and evaluation. And fifth, communication and outreach. And where are we today? We start the implementation because I'm heading the interim delivery unit. And then we start also conversation with different African countries to engage with them and also the partners. And this initiative is a bit different from anyone we have seen so far because it's a number of strengths. First, it has a strong political will and clear vision because is the head of the state at the highest level for the first time. They embark in such kind of initiative, but it will require institutional innovation. That is why the delivery unit for this initiative will be completely purely independent, even if located in any institution. And it brings together the imperative of short-term and long-term. That is poverty, eating today, and the climate. And the development also has gone through a consultative process, wider consultative process. And those are very briefly some of the elements I just want to highlight in order to have conversation with you. To go to detail, I have some leaflet, those who will be interested, and there will be also a number of slides even specifically on different aspects of the initiative. Thank you. Sorry to have been too long.
No, you were not too long at all, Dr. Yoba. You're spot on. I think there's a lot of interest in the African Renewable Energy Initiative. When we come to these kinds of negotiations, sometimes we are all very disappointed that not much is happening, but it's very inspiring with initiatives like this, which actually give a lot of hope. So I'm sure there'll be a lot more interest during the question time. Now it's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Mariama Williams from the South Center, who has looked at this report called the Roadmap of 100 Billion. Just to put the situation in context, if you recall in 2010 in Cancun, under the Bali Action Plan, or what's called under the convention actually, parties agreed that developed countries will mobilize the sum of US $100 billion per year by 2020. And as a result of that, one of the very important tasks is done by what's called the Standing Committee on Finance, which actually is a convention body which was set up, also which got launched in Cancun. And the purpose of the Standing Committee, which is actually made up of developed and developing country negotiators, is actually to really look at the climate finance as to really how much is coming, how much is who's receiving, what are the transparency rules, is it clear, how is it counted, is it double counted, triple counted, what's taken into account, what's not taken into account, and so on and so forth. So the Standing Committee on Finance has actually come up with a new report. It's called the Biennial Assessment 2016. You will hear about this next week. In fact, there was an event just now, I understand, but you can see it on the website of the UNFCCC, where that is a report coming from the Standing Committee, which is a United Nations Framework Convention body. And just to flag that under one of the major findings which has come out from the Standing Committee is that if you look at the biennial reports, these are reports that the developed countries have to provide. According to the biennial reports of the developed countries, $25.4 billion flowed from developed to developing countries. This was in 2013. And in 2014, $26.6 billion was flowed from developed to developing countries. Now, Mariama Williams will tell you that the roadmap of the 100 billion, which was commissioned by the Australia and the UK, their figures are something else. And I won't tell you what the figures are, but it's for her to tell you what those figures are and how they came about. And so there's going to be a huge contestation during the climate finance discussion and also the facilitative dialogue as to what are really the numbers on the table in terms of real climate finance. And is there some, are the developed countries sticking to the agreement on the roadmap 200 billion? Now that's the answer that Mariama Williams is going to provide us. Mariama.
Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Once again, thank you very much for coming to this site event. And I'm really, I've appreciated the previous speaker, and in particular, Dr. Yoba, who talk about a specific action strategy and action plan and action for transformation in the African continent. which we're really quite supportive of, and which finances one of the pegs, one of the 5 or so pegs that he flagged as part of that. So this, many people know this this roadmap, huh? People know about this roadmap that the developed countries were, I hesitate to use the word mandated, but actually they were urged to produce a roadmap under 1 CP21 of the outcome agreement, not the Paris Agreement, but the outcome document adopting the Paris Agreement, Part 5, enhanced action prior to 2020, paragraph 114, where they were to provide a concrete roadmap to achieve the goal of jointly providing US $100 billion by 2020 for adaptation and mitigation, while significantly increasing adaptation finance from current levels, and to further provide appropriate technology and capacity building support. So that is a specific context in addition to the wider framing that Mina gave. So what we're talking about is pre-2020. This has nothing to do with post-2020 finance. This roadmap is about how we get from here to 2020. I know there's a lot of figures flowing about, and Mina flagged some. So there are some terms that I'd like us to be very clear on. Bilateral public finance, multilateral finance, and mobilized private finance. So those are the 3 figures. And if you don't get those 3 concepts clear, then the numbers become kind of a jumble, right? So the public finance that's reported in the standing committee report that Mina cited, that number 4, is public finance from bilateral entities to developing countries directly, or that they have contributed to directly. Then there is the multilateral finance that developed countries have contributed to the MDBs or to multilateral funds, right? And then the third category is what they're calling mobilized private finance. This is private finance that is leveraged by the developed countries, whether they give it directly to a private sector entity to operate in the developing countries or through some other modes. So it's called mobilized private finance. And so you've got to be very clear about that when you're looking at the numbers about what is being counted or not counted. So I want to say, first of all, that the roadmap, we have to accept that the roadmap is a political document, right? It's meant to address the expectation of developing countries. So it's first and foremost a political document, a political tool. Second, it is an accounting exercise, right? Now, how good the accounting exercise is and whether it's acceptable to all depends on the stakeholders for whom this roadmap is meant and the agreement among them as to what definitions are used in the roadmap and what are the methodology and the framework for accounting. Otherwise, you have discrepancies and disagreements. Now, in the roadmap, which is produced with the consultation of at least 39 developed countries, plus the European Commission, they argue that in producing this roadmap, they have consulted with developing countries. However, there's no listing of the developing countries that have been consulted. And so far, I've talked to many developing countries, and I have yet to find one. And it may be that my grouping of developing countries are very narrow and very self-selected, but I haven't found one who has been consulted on this. So that's the first thing. So there are 4 or 5 points I want to make. One is the way you also need to look at the roadmap in terms of the geographic distribution of what is claimed in the roadmap, as well as the thematic distribution. Was it faithful in terms of meeting the goal of paragraph 114? What percentage is being allocated to adaptation, mitigation, technology transfer, and capacity building, which are the 4 thematic areas that are mandated in paragraph 114. And so that's the context in which I looked at the report, and in which many of our NGO colleagues have also been looking at this report. So the basic argument from the report is that yes, based on the pledges that were made last year, up until COP22 and including up until this September of this year, developed countries are on their way to meeting the $100 billion commitment by 2020. And that currently the starting point, so where the disagreements lies are the starting point of two categories. What is the flow of climate finance, 2013, 2014, because that's the base of this report, and what is the gap that is to be met. And so this report, this roadmap, is accompanied by a technical document produced by the OECD 2016, which lays out all of the categories and distinctions that were made. But that 2016 OECD document is the foundation of it is the OECD report in 2015, of which many of the criticisms that many of us made about the methodology, the components of public finance have not been reviewed or changed. So the fundamental criticism lies there, and that's the foundation for this report. So I would ask you to go back and look at some of the critiques of that. I'll flag a few here. Mina, please help me keep on track, because I will tend to run off a little bit. So what the report says is that based on OECD 2015, an average of $41 billion was contributed by developed countries to developing countries, and that they are projecting, based on the pledges that were made 2016, that $26 billion of public finance. Now, the public finance is of two categories. Public finance is the bilateral finance and the finance that came from developed countries to the MDBs and multilateral fund. So when you put that in, you'll get 26. So if you have the 41 average and you put the 26, you end up with $67 to $68 billion of public finance that will be available by 2020, or from every year, presumably, up until 2020. That obviously doesn't go very far for the $100 billion. So what they then say, if we assume the leverage ratio of mobilized private finance, right? Finance that developed countries were able to mobilize through their private sector or other entity, we can get another 24.2 billion, right? So if you had that 24.2 billion to the 67, 68, you're up to 90 billion or so. And including in that is 1.6 billion of export credit. And we can have a lot of arguments about export credit, but they've put that in. But when you go back to the technical document of the OECD, they're actually arguing that the developed countries will overachieve their $100 billion by 90 to $133 billion. And that's all about that mobilized private finance. It depends on the mobilized ratio. If you use 0.5 up to 0.11, so each dollar gets 0.5 up to 0.11, you will get up to $133 billion by 2020. So then you then need to critique all of those components to see, is this real? Well, remember now, this is not money on the table. So that's the first thing you must remember. These are projections. And the report itself says these are uncertain, and we're using the average of 2013. We're assuming that developed countries will contribute the same as they did in 2013. We're assuming the leverage ratio will be the same as they are at this point. So these are scenarios and they're projection, which led to a very interesting article I read, and I point you to you by the Brookings Institute, which said, where's the money? After going through the roadmap, there is no money on the table. If you remember Fast Start Finance, there was $30 billion per year for the 3 years. There is no money here. That's why it's an accounting exercise, right? So we still have not come up with the money. And that's very critical for ministers in a facilitative dialogue to be careful about what is the climate finance flow, what is the gap we're talking about finding. And if you look at many analysis, the gap that the OECD start with, which is 41 billion that they must top up to get to 40, many people are arguing that that gap is not real. That if you actually take the categories and investigate them, you might be talking about a gap, if you look at Oxfam, of from 17 to 20, or World Bank 2015 argued that there's a climate finance gap of 70 to $80 billion. So this $26 billion that they're saying that they can be sure of from the pledges that were made is way off from that. So let's look a little bit at the components very quickly. Bilateral flow. Okay, is there a problem with that? Yes, there's a problem with bilateral flows. Increasingly, most of it loans. About 42% of it are loans. Most of France bilateral aid, climate aid loans. Secondly, bilateral aid that are targeted is tagged as climate relevant or climate significant. When some reporters and some experts have gone in to look at the project document that are based on the tagging of these as climate finance, it's been found that at least with German climate finance, 25 to even 50% of them, you cannot find the climate component in the project document. So there is question about the ODA component of it and the fact that much of it is loan. So that's the private sector. That's the public bilateral part. If you go and you look at the multilateral MDBs and so forth, same issue. I was just at the BA report that Mina flagged, and they've argued that 83% of the multilateral development bank climate finance consists of loans. Okay? So we're talking about loans, not grants. So there's an issue. There's also a question with the MDBs that their figures tend to overestimate their contribution because they tend to include co-financing and various other kinds of issues in it. So the two categories have problems. Those are not new problems. There were problems that were highly critiqued by a multitude of researchers in the 2015 OECD report that have simply been glossed over, not explained, not reviews, not saying, well, this is why we're doing it because you said this is it, but here we are. Then in terms of the private flow, which is probably the most problematic, because if you see 1/3 of the $100 billion is coming from mobilized private finance. Now, mobilized private finance is problematic on a number of levels. One, it is not predictable. It is volatile. We have problems actually accounting for it because of confidentiality and various kinds of issues about measuring. So there's a lot of uncertainty about measuring climate finance. But there's also an inherent problem with mobilizing it. So mobilize with reporting the mobilization, because the mobilizing, the ratio is the return private finance. Some of that mobilization is coming from policies and action taken by developing countries. But the OECD countries are taking the full value of the mobilization amount as part of their contribution. Part of that has to go to developing countries because the funds is used in developing countries using the regulatory framework. Some developing countries give tax breaks, tax write-off, various kinds of things. Those things must be accounted for. Now, it's hard to disaggregate those, but you must put that as part of the issue, the challenge around private finance. And there are many other issues. Export credit, even though it's a small proportion, it's only $1.6 billion. But export credit, they're talking about insurance, right? So you're not really mobilizing anything. I was going to set up a plant in Zambia. You're giving me insurance. I was already going to set the plant up. You're giving me insurance. So there's a whole question as to whether or not this is actually new mobilized, or you're actually just helping to subsidize firms that would have already made the contribution. So these are a few of the issues around why there are such contentions around the report. For me, the most positive thing about the report is that we have a roadmap. Because for the last 4 years, since Copenhagen and Cancun, I've heard developing countries in forum after forum asking for a roadmap that would explain, and developing countries and developed countries dodging it or not stepping up to the plate. But so the fact that they've actually produced a roadmap saying, yes, we really do commit to it, and here's what we want to do. But it's not enough because there is no money on the table, and these are all projections and scenarios. So, and that's where I'd like to leave it, Mina.
Thank you very much, Mariama. So with that backdrop, it's very helpful that there seems to be a game of smokes and mirrors here. What is really the truth and what is not? And I think this is where those of us who are watching the process, particularly from civil society, have to have a very critical eye in terms of numbers and how this is done. Now, we have about 20 minutes, but before I open to question and answer, I'd just like to tell you that for those of you who come to these events, sometimes you are wondering what on earth is going on. And you're not, understanding the processes. TWN, which is the Third World Network, we have a booth at 11D, and we put out these updates every day. And if you look at the daily program, you will have a link in the daily program that takes you right to our website, and there is also a token that you can use to see our materials. Now, we have produced this latest update to give you a state of play of what's going on and what you can expect to see in the next 2 weeks. So apart from the climate finance dialogue, which is the climate finance ministerial, which will take place on the 14th, is it Mariama, or 15th?
Sorry.
We'll give you the date in a while. I can't remember that. Yeah, it's on the convene on the 16th of November. It's the second biennial ministerial on climate finance. It'll be very interesting because you will be able to hear about what's happening on that front. And then you heard about the facilitative dialogue earlier that Mr. Ravi Prasad of India stressed, which was actually looking at the implementation of the existing obligations. And that is taking place in 2 parts, on the 14th, I think, and on the 11th and then on the 14th. And that relates to pre-2020 implementation obligations, including the Doha Amendment. Now, that is a high-level ministerial which is taking place. So that's a very important place also to be, to actually see whether the existing obligations are being met. And the question that Siddharth posed, what are going to be the concrete outcomes in terms of ensuring that the existing commitments are going to be met? Already the Doha Amendment to the second commitment of the Kyoto Protocol has not come into effect. The developed countries agreed that they would, at least on the aggregate, reduce their emissions by 80%, 18% below 1990 levels. They agreed that they will revisit their ambition in 2014, none of which has happened. So that's going to be a very important area to see whether the developed countries will honor those commitments. And then you have this big discussion which is happening under the CMA, which is the Conference of Parties meeting as the parties to the Paris Agreement, as was also pointed out by Mr. Ravi. And if you were sitting in the conference hall this morning, the COP president of Morocco assured that the process is going to be inclusive, because only 100, so far 100 parties have ratified the Paris Agreement, but that does not mean that all 100 parties will be already parties, because once you ratify, it takes 30 days before you become a party, an actual party. So as you remember in Paris, once the Paris Agreement got adopted, many tasks were assigned in terms of the crafting of the rules. This is what's called the Paris Work Program, or some people call it the modalities, procedures, and guidelines in the convention lingo, which is called the MPGs. In other words, they're just about rules that will be crafted to implement the Paris Agreement. Now, one of the bodies that actually came into being last year, which was this year, which was established by the Paris decision, was the ad hoc working group on the Paris Agreement. We have to remember that all the implementation issues related to the Paris Agreement is not just the APA, which is called APA, is not the only body dealing with the tasks that are for the implementation of the Paris Agreement. The subsidiary body for implementation, the SUBSTA, and there are very many, the Adaptation Committee, the Technology Mechanism, there are many bodies which also have responsibilities. So when we talk about the implementation of the tasks, we have to remember that the focus is not just the APA. We have to also pay attention to what's going on in the other bodies as well. Another very important aspect is, so what will happen when the CMA convenes next week? What we understand is that because the work is only starting now, the session in May, for instance, the APA met in May and the subsidiary bodies have just begun their work. So it's too soon for them to conclude any work, because the CMA is supposed to adopt the conclusions coming from the work of these bodies. That will not take place in Marrakesh. So what will need to happen is for the CMA to convene, and then what they will do is to have a procedural decision to then mandate all the bodies to continue the work under the Conference of Parties. Because the Conference of Parties includes all the parties to the convention, whereas the CMA is only those who have ratified. And so to give this process an inclusive, make it inclusive, this is why the Conference of Parties will take on the oversight of the bodies. So the question that remains is, when will the CMA then resume? Now that question has not been answered yet. A large number of countries are proposing that the CMA be suspended and resume work in 2018, because a lot of them feel that we need enough time to complete the work. There are others who are stressing that we need the CMA to convene in 2017 to take stock of what's going on, because they feel that the urgency, that's the way to push and make parties realize that this is an urgent process. So how this will play out, we don't know, and what agreement will happen, we don't know, but consultations are going on, and by next week we will know. So the CMA is really one of a big more celebratory exercise, applause and so on, but it's not going to do much work other than transmit the work to be done by the COP to all the bodies. Now, what are the issues under the APA? Very quickly, for those of you who are following that process, right now at 4 o'clock, I think they should be convened already. The co-chairs have actually issued a scenario note. Now, all of this is in this update. Go pick it up. Otherwise, go to the website. It explains what is in the scenario note. There are basically 6 agenda items which are really important in relation to the APA agenda. One big area is called the nationally determined contributions relating to features, information, and accounting. Now, this is very contentious still, because if you recall in Paris, what had happened in Paris was that actually Paris was not really a negotiation. Why I say that is because you had you had parties making submissions and parties making statements, and the presidency came up with the draft decision agreement, and then you had parties going and seeing the presidency behind the scenes, and last day you had a Paris agreement. Now, basically, there was agreement to adopt the agreement, but there will be a lot of interpretive fights which will continue. Because if you look at the articles of the Paris Agreement, for instance, what is this animal called the nationally determined contributions? It depends on which negotiator you ask. If you ask the United States what the nationally determined contribution is, they will say it's about your mitigation action. If you talk to somebody from the like-minded developing country, if you talk to Malaysia, or if you talk to China or India, what they will tell you is that nationally determined contribution is what's in Article 3 of the agreement. And Article 3 of the agreement actually states the full scope of what's an NDC. And what they say is the nationally determined contribution, that is what parties will contribute. And they say that this is reflected in the articles below. And basically, it's about mitigation, it's about adaptation, it's about the means of implementation. So that's the full scope of the nationally determined contribution. So when you go to if you look at the submissions that parties have provided under the features, information, and accounting, you will see a lot of emphasis on the mitigation component of the NDC. If you look at the like-minded submission, you will see that they say the full scope of the NDC is is the feature itself, in which is that it is nationally determined, that the feature is that it contains the full scope, and therefore the information also should relate to the full scope. So you will see these fights happening because parties will have to pronounce themselves on actually how they understand the Paris Agreement. So while some people argue that it's not a renegotiation of Paris, this is not about a renegotiation of Paris, but rather an interpretation of Paris. Paris Agreement, how the parties see it. So those of us who are lawyers, we know. You hire one lawyer and ask the lawyer to look at an agreement, you'll have one view. You hire another lawyer and to look at that agreement by another party, they will look at it in another way. So there is a gamut of ambiguity and interpretive fights that will happen. Then there is this discussion about the adaptation communication, guidance on the adaptation communication. Now, what is this animal called the adaptation communication? The history behind the adaptation communication was that many of the developing countries were of the view that you cannot have a Paris Agreement which is mitigation centric. And that was really the intention of the developed countries. If you recall, the whole idea of a new agreement was to replace the Kyoto Protocol, because the developed countries were the only parties who had any obligations under the Kyoto Protocol. So they were actually looking at an agreement which would replace the Kyoto Protocol and bring developing countries on board for an agreement which would be mitigation centric. That did not succeed in Paris. And so what you have is the developing countries saying, it's not just if you just talk about a temperature goal in terms of 2.2 degrees or pursuing efforts to 1.5 degrees, you also need a goal on adaptation. You also need a goal on finance, and which is also there. You also need to have an adaptation contribution, because what developing countries were saying is that a lot of us are already contributing to adaptation and even are doing a lot for loss and damage. Because even if we don't have resources, this is already something that we have no choice but to deal with. Whether it's a flood, whether it's a cyclone impact, whether it's a the sea level, rise, and therefore your coastlines disappearing. All this developing countries are having to address without any choice. So they're already contributing with the limited resources that they have to adaptation. So they said, you cannot just have mitigation in terms of what our contribution is, because we are also contributing to adaptation. So this is why you have the notion of an adaptation contribution, and the adaptation communication is supposed to reflect that contribution. So parties have a choice. Either you can communicate what you're doing in your adaptation as a component of your NDC, of your nationally determined contribution, or you can also communicate it through your national adaptation plans, or you can also communicate it in your communication of the national communications. Those are just vehicles, the vehicles of choice in where you would communicate what you're doing on adaptation. But the point is that the emphasis is that you have to recognize the developing country contribution on adaptation. So that's the significance of the adaptation. And then you have this big discussion that will happen on transparency. Now, what is transparency? What is this whole transparency framework about? Now, the transparency framework is really about rules, the measurement, reporting, and verification of information. Because what you want to do is you want to track whether parties, when they say what they will do, are they doing what they will do? And so you have what's called a transparency framework, or transparency of action and transparency of support. The fight there is really this, because developed countries want a common transparency framework. What they say is that there must be the enhanced transparency framework that we agreed in the Paris Agreement has to be a common transparency framework. Developing countries, a number of them, particularly led by the LMDC and even the African group, are saying, no, you cannot have a common transparency framework because we had different capacities. So you have to have differentiated transparency framework, differentiated between developed and developing countries. And there is this notion of flexibility, because developed countries have agreed that developing countries will have flexibility, that we are all not on the same starting point. And so therefore there will be flexibility. But some of the developing countries are arguing that the flexibility should be for all developing countries. It's not for some developing countries. It's not just for the small islands. It's not just for the African states. It's not just for the LDCs. That all developing countries who don't have capacities as defined by them should have the flexibility. So this will be a bit of a fight, because if you look at the co-chair scenario note, what they are saying is that it's not just a technical issue, it's also a political issue. And that might hold up the way in which the transparency framework unfolds. And there is another issue in relation to the transparency of action and transparency of support. Developing countries are saying that over the years, there is already this transparency of action that has moved forward. If you remember, there is the biennial reports, the biennial update reports, you have the IAR, which is the International Assessment and Analysis, and then you also have the multilateral assessment. But what they are saying is that there is this, what you call it, transparency of support has not got the same, what you call it, attention. So the transparency of support should move first in terms of clarity on what the finance is, what the technology is, because that is the one that will allow for ambition to move forward. So progression should be on all levels. It's not just progression on mitigation, because what developing countries say, that the extent to which we are able to do a lot of this depends on the technology and the finance that we are getting. Otherwise, you will not have any progress. I understand Dr. Yoba has to go and already approaching 4:30. I will stop there. There is also the issue of the global stock take, but that's basically to take stock of the collective efforts of parties in terms of the goals, not just a long-term goal on emissions, but it's about all the goals in terms of how are we meeting the overall assessment in terms of all the finance, technology, adaptation, and mitigation as well, and technology transfer and capacity building. I'll end there. So get the briefing paper. We also have an update on the website in relation to the Paris Agreement and how we see it. Now, we are going to run out of time soon, but before more people come, maybe there are a few questions for Dr. Yoba or any one of us in the panel. Let's take a few questions. Please raise your hand quickly if you have questions. Please identify to whom you want to address the question to, and also your name.
Thank you. My name is Tendai Maroa. My question is directed to the presenter on finance. Considering that the NDCs, most of them were conditional, and the fact that we are failing to raise funds, does it mean that it is not worth celebrating those pledges made, because it will not be possible to implement most of the measures? You may have your view on that. Thank you.
Very good question. What about any other question? We'll have one more question. Yes. Here, Yvonne.
Good afternoon. I'm Jonathan Odongo from Kenya. My question is to Yuba Sokona on renewable energy. Do you think Africa can rely 100% on renewable energy? And what is the future of oil in Africa now that countries are discovering oil, including my own country, Kenya? Thank you.
Very good question. You first and then Mariama.
No, this is an interesting question. And it's, if we look at the situation in Africa actually, on the energy system, you will find out a part, North Africa and South Africa, most of the part of the continent have not yet built their energy system. And if the energy system, and that we know based on the fossil fuel, this is centralized systems, and that means a large part of the population will never have access to. And then all the serious studies indicated that under current conditions, up to 2020, up to 2050, there will be more people not having access to electricity than actually. This one element. Second, a large part of electricity produced in the continent actually is fossil fuel-based production. And in most of the African countries, particularly in West Africa, those who are largely based on fossil fuel, not hydro, you will find where it's available, the minimum price of electricity, tariff of electricity, the minimum is between 18, 20 cents. In some cases, it's 50 cents per kilowatt hour. In that context, what industrialization you will make? Take Nigeria, it's an oil producing country, exporting. You know the tariff of electricity there? It's higher than what you can produce by renewables. And you need also huge investment. Look at if we have actually who is paying the price of the what you pay for the landline on telephone is almost nil. But how many households are connected to landline? And then how many have access to cell? And then you have to have that in mind. And then the future of many parts of the world is to move away from the fossil fuel base if you are serious about the climate. And at the same time, renewable energy offers us more perspective in the African context because of the kind of economy. And then the way also where the human settlement are established. As I indicated, I said that you can produce the small amount based on the resources you have, and then you can scale it. You can add on it. And this is one of the constraints of renewables is related to the storage. And then the storage is becoming more cheaper, more efficient, more compact. When we start on renewable back to some 15, 20 years ago, it was unbelievable. The cost was unbelievable high. And actually, there's a dramatic drop on the prices. And then the problem is that you have two options. One option to go smarter, and then the other option is to go dirty. Which option do you want to take today? Look at China. I don't know if you are familiar, you have been in Beijing. Sometimes 100 meters you cannot see. That's related to pollution, air pollution. And then one of the major problems they're facing, how to get rid of pollution. Do you want to experiment that? Or is there any other options? There is a wide range of options in the African context, up to the African to decide which route they want to take. Those are my short response.
I will be very quick. Okay, one, we know that we have a history of going from pledges to actual contribution to actually being able to spend the money that's been pledged. So that we need to work on and accept pledges for what they are. They are pledges. They are not real money on the table. So then there's a lot of work to transform those into real money. With regard to the LDCs, what is even more important, I think, than the pledges is the nature of the flow of what is passing for climate finance that are being supposedly contributed to LDCs. What is it that is being financed? We know, for example, the LDCF, the Least Developing Countries Fund, is very underfunded, and that most of the NAPA, the National Adaptation Programs that were developed since the last 5 years, and of those that have been transformed into programmatic things in the pipeline, there is very little that have been funded, so that the LDCs are not actually getting their funding. So I think and when you read the roadmap, and when they get to the point where they talk about, yes, they're predicting a doubling of adaptation funding up to 2020. But they also spend about 5 or 6 pages explaining why it is that it's impossible or it shouldn't be advisable to balance adaptation and mitigation financing. And they list a whole bunch of reasons as to why adaptation financing is quite different from mitigation finances and why you shouldn't actually push for those to be balanced, but that there will be a doubling of the financing. Yes, you want to qualify something? Go ahead.
I'm sorry, we already overrun, but please talk to Mariama. But to answer your question, if the conditional pledges are not, the NDCs that don't have any money, they can't be delivered. So that's the long and short answer.
Nope, I don't have any here.
Thank you for coming.
All right, that's what you were talking about, INDC. That was very good, Yoga. We should talk a little bit about this funding finance thing.